I'm Jeff Asher, and this is the Jeff-alytics podcast. When we talk about crime, the loudest voices rather than the data usually drive the headlines. But inside state houses, the numbers can shape how criminal justice actually works. In this episode, I talk with Whitney Westerfield, a former prosecutor, Kentucky state senator, and most importantly, fellow triplet dad, about how to drive smarter criminal justice policy. Whitney shares what he's learned from years of navigating the tensions between fear on one hand and data on the other, between public pressure and principled votes. We dig into his work leading Kentucky's juvenile justice reforms and what it takes to balance victims' needs with effective evidence-based policies. He also reflects on how crime data is often misunderstood and what lawmakers and advocates can do to bridge that gap. Here's my conversation with Whitney Westerfield on using data, empathy, and experience to make public safety smarter, not louder. My guest today is the wonderful Whitney Westerfield, who I wanted to have on the show for numerous reasons. Of course, his experience in state legislature, working on criminal justice issues, and probably most important, like myself, is the father of triplets.
That's right.
So I guess, Whitney, can you take me through your background and how you got here and what you're doing now?
I'm just glad to be a part of the Triplet podcast this morning here as we record this.
We love data here.
And diapers. Data and diapers. That data could have been the headline or the title of your show. The data and diapers. I'm all good. I got thinking there about triplets. What was your quiz? You just asked me, Jeff.
This is by far the fastest I have ever been able to get off subject matter with a guest. What is your background and what are you doing now?
I'm an attorney by trade, and I was a prosecutor when I got right out of law school, passed the bar exam, and went to work as a prosecutor and left the prosecutor's office to run for the state senate against a 20-year incumbent who had never been beaten. And I narrowly won 15 years ago, or however many years, 13 years ago, and became a state senator and served for 12 years, was chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee from the first day to my last day. All 3 terms I was in office, and I have spent all of that time in the legislature working on criminal justice policy. And as I've left the legislature now, decided not to run for re-election last year, I've continued to be involved in the criminal justice policy space and hope to continue being involved nationally to help policymakers make the best decisions based on the data that they've got and hopefully make policy decisions to have better data going forward. But that's what brings us here and brings you and me together. Our worlds have collided because of your very outstanding resource, the Real-Time Crime Index. I actually was talking to somebody about it again yesterday and encouraged them to go and look at it. They were asking some questions about crime data and crime rates, and I said, here's a resource you got to have. And I bring it up in front of legislators all the time because it's a long overdue resource that is going to do a lot of good.
I appreciate that. And that's actually, that's how we met. I think you tweeted about it once, and I reached out, and we started meeting then. So
you have, when I was still chair, you have testified before the Interim Joint Committee on Judiciary in Kentucky, and I've made sure that my colleagues and now former colleagues remember that resource is there, and have encouraged them to keep you on the forefront and have that resource linked so that when they want to know what's going on in Kentucky, and to encourage more law enforcement agencies to report. Not just our big cities in Louisville, Lexington, but everywhere. If I can get any police agency, and not just in Kentucky, to give you more data, that's all to the good.
I love that. How did your experience as a prosecutor play into your overall approach to criminal justice in the legislature?
It's a double-edged sword, Jeff. It gave me an invaluable perspective on the system, and that continues to pay dividends. It continues to be a benefit to know. I've been on call and have done a search warrant at 2:00 in the morning for a police officer that's investigating some incident. I've been the one that's had to prepare the affidavit in a search warrant to know and to make a judgment call about whether or not this meets the probable cause standard to give to a judge so that they can determine whether or not I was right. And I know what it's like to try a case from start to finish. I know what it's like to work with a crime victim. I know what it's like to hold their hand, to hug them, to shake their hand and dry their tears. And I know what it's like to deal with wins and losses in the courtroom, and I know what it's like to deal with drug court and to see the value of the drug court program. To know all those inner workings has been invaluable, and it continues to inform It worked to inform my policy work over 12 years. And now in my extra legislative life outside of the legislature, because apart from policy work that I do, advocating here and there and working with national organizations like Arnold Ventures, the Justice Action Network before that, the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL, active in that regard, but I'm also the Director of Legal and Director of Government Affairs for a community mental health center. And there are countless ways where behavioral health and the criminal justice system intersect and interact, and frankly, places where they need to do that more, because there are a lot of people or a lot of population that overlap in those two spaces. But I said it's a double-edged sword. It also put blinders on me. I remember as a prosecutor having a very specific worldview about the criminal justice system and how it should work, what sort of outcomes we should be getting, what the policies should be. And it took a couple of cycles in the legislature, took a few sessions in the legislature before I put those blinders down, before I realized I had them on and had sense enough to put them down. I didn't trust the defense bar and public defenders as much and their input and their perspective as much as a brand new legislator. Didn't have to think about the defense bar to win the seat. But as a committee chair, I was duty bound to consider the whole system and not just the prosecutor's perspective, but the defense bar perspective, the victim's perspective, and the family of the defendant and their perspective, the judge's perspective. So as much as it enabled me to do my job very well, it also sent me into the job with a very narrow worldview about the criminal justice system that took some time to open up.
And so I'm going to let you brag here for a second. If you were to look back at anything you accomplished related to criminal justice in the legislature, what's the thing that you're proudest of?
There'd have to be a couple things, but Senate Bill 200, Kentucky's juvenile justice overhaul, is at or near the top of the list. I'm proud of Marcy's Law, which is Kentucky's brand of victims' constitutional rights. It's very unique to our system and our Constitution. Those two would probably be at the top of the list. They were huge legislative lifts. There were parts of both of those things that are really really easy parts, but they also came with really difficult parts. And there have been countless other initiatives and small pieces. I can't answer that question without adding also Senate Bill 90, which won't mean anything to anyone outside of Kentucky, but it was a pilot program that came about 3 or 4 years ago. In fact, it'll run out at the end of this calendar year if it's not renewed in the 26th session when the legislature reconvenes in January. It's a pilot program to divert back to my behavioral health, how I've learned and gotten better. It came from a bail reform conversation a number of years ago. And the bottom line is, everybody in the room, from the defense bar to prosecution to judges, law enforcement, everybody agreed that most of the people that came through the justice system were also dealing with behavioral health issues. And wouldn't it be nice if we plugged them into that behavioral health care a lot earlier in the process? Senate Bill 90 is a behavioral health sort of intervention or diversion program that initiates at booking and flags people who need behavioral health interventions and gives them a chance to get access to that right away. And if they do well, if they meet all their benchmarks and they're successful according to the provider, not a prosecutor, not a judge, not a defense attorney, but according to the healthcare provider, because this is a very clinical focused approach. But if you're doing well, you have a chance to get your charges dismissed and diverted away. And you have the benefit of what we already do at plea right now in Kentucky. We have a diversion for low-level felony offenders. We wanted to create that at the front end and get those people into the care that everybody in the room agreed they needed earlier. Those three things are my crowning achievements, I think.
That's awesome. And so you talked a lot about the double-edged sword of being a prosecutor and growing and learning. And as I was getting ready for our chat, I was going through votesmart.org, which has just, lists of how people vote. And your last major key vote, I guess it says, in 2024 was you were one of 3 Republicans that voted no on a veto override of House Bill 5, which I don't know if you remember, to increase penalties for violent crime.
For a long time, man.
Well, so can you help, provide us the backstory there? And I really just want to know, obviously, as a Republican, you usually vote Republican. How does one, especially when you've got an issue that you feel very strongly about, how do you go about deciding to vote against your party? How do you cross the aisle there? And how do we get more of that in American politics to where we, solve all of our problems? But, what's the backstory here?
Well, the bill had a lot of political wind behind it. It had a lot of really strong political tailwinds that were helping it. It was not informed by data. In fact, it was misinformed by data. There were some, in fact, if you wanted to dig and do some spelunking, you could find stories about how the bill sponsor actually cited some data that either didn't exist or didn't apply to Kentucky or applied in a different situation. It wasn't an apples to apples comparison.
What was the overall idea behind the bill?
Tougher on crime. Let's create more penalties. Let's create longer penalties and longer sentences. There's a homelessness provision that allows criminalization of homelessness, which I find just morally objectionable and counterproductive. I can get into more of that in a second, but there were a handful of things in there that I thought were worthwhile, and I said so on the floor. I said it in committee. I said I don't question the intent behind the bill at all. Not one page of it. I don't believe that the sponsor was ill-intending things. I don't think there's an issue there, but they weren't following the numbers. They weren't following the data. They weren't relying on anything that showed why doing X was going to result in better outcome Y. It just messaged well. Well, we've got crime exploding in Louisville. It originated in Louisville. We've got crime exploding in Louisville. We got to respond to it. These people are getting out. They're doing all the stuff, and the responses to that were longer sentences for people and casting a wider net. And it's going to end up capturing offenders that we don't mean to catch, holding people longer that we don't intend to hold longer, and that doesn't do any good for public safety. In fact, harms public safety and harms that person, harms their family and their community. And it's frustrating to see that. I voted against it because of all the parts that I didn't like. The homelessness provision, for instance, I fought for a floor amendment when it came over to the Senate the first time around to require, before you can charge someone and take them to the county jail after citing them for homelessness, the law enforcement officer must offer to take them to a healthcare provider or behavioral health or housing provider of some kind. Whatever they need, you have to try to take them there first. There wasn't enough support just for that. We have Good Samaritan language in other bills. We can't. I mean, that's a really low bar. Can we not offer them assistance? I mean, if you offer them and they refuse, then fine. I guess. I still think that's not the right outcome. Certainly not at first, because people that are homeless need homes, need housing, need food and shelter and care, not the county jail drunk tank necessarily. But there were not enough votes to support adopting that amendment. There was a bill in there, or a section in there, that allowed for the forfeiture of firearms, or we already have forfeiture of firearms in Kentucky, but it allows the surviving family member of a homicide case to acquire that firearm and have it destroyed. I think that's great. We got plenty of guns in Kentucky. I've got some in this office right now. I'm fine with guns. I'm a big supporter of the Second Amendment. I think if a gun's used in a homicide, we can probably be okay with letting that be destroyed and off the streets permanently. The problem, though, with that language is that it required the family members to bid on the gun. We already have an auction process for forfeited firearms. It just allows them to bid. So what if somebody wanted to outbid the surviving family? It's just a gross way of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there were no willing people to change that language. Those are just a couple of really quick examples. There are others. We have a violent offender statute that changes parole eligibility from the standard 20% we have in Kentucky. We have a couple of charges at 50% before you're eligible to be paroled. And then we have the violent offender crimes that are 85%. And those are crimes are generally what you think they are. And this bill added to that list. I don't have a problem with most of those additions, but a couple of them were too broad. And I told folks, you're going to catch people you don't intend to catch, who don't belong on this list and don't need to serve 85% of their sentence. That fell on deaf ears because it sounded like those opponents of that, like me, wanted to be softer on these real bad guys that are dangerous to community. No, the details matter and the facts matter. And if you cast so broad a net thoughtlessly without regard to the nuance that must be involved, and when you're talking about criminal justice, it's all nuance. It's all fact specific. Because the crime I commit today in Kentucky law, a Class C felony, say, for instance, our second to lowest level of penalty. It's a 5 to 10 year penalty range. Well, the guy that commits the same Class C felony tomorrow is a different guy, a different set of circumstances, a different crime. His might warrant 5 years, mine might warrant 10. Similarly, the system has to have that sort of flexibility throughout. If you're not following the data and paying attention to what works and what doesn't work, and you're just thoughtlessly increasing penalties, you're increasing the cost to taxpayer, you're taking resources away from law enforcement, away from public health services, behavioral health services that everyone supports and knows that we need, and everyone agrees that we're not giving enough money to. That's that bill and why I voted against it. And then the answer about how we get more people to do something different, you got to elect better people. And I'm not saying I was great. I think I did a good job for my time in the office. But I also know I screwed up a lot, and I know that it took too long for those blinders as a prosecutor to come off my eyes. But I also think I finished as a really solid legislator who was willing to consider lots of perspectives and wasn't willing to move forward just because a bill felt good. I wanted to know that it was going to work. I wanted to have some evidence that at least suggested that it was a reliable path for public policy to take. And you need to elect people that are willing to do that. We could have a whole another podcast, Jeff, about the primary system in America and how that doesn't inspire those sorts of candidates.
Yeah,
we're definitely, but we don't have that kind of time in this episode.
No, we don't, and we'll have to start a new podcast for that one, for sure. You mentioned the nuance of sort of the public safety and the criminal justice and approaching it from a policy perspective. Part of that nuance is obviously in working with victims and taking into consideration the, of course, just horrific circumstances that the victims and their families find themselves in. How do you take that into account in a responsible manner that, one, doesn't just completely demolish the criminal justice system, and then also at a time like today where generally we're seeing falling crime, we're seeing falling murder, how do you sort of balance those two things out where the victims may want, strong retribution and strong punishment and certainly deserve justice, but also you want to be able to acknowledge the direction that things are going? I know that's a very difficult balance to be able to meet. So how do you do that responsibly as a policymaker?
Your last sentence there, your last line is exactly where I would start. You acknowledge the fact that they've experienced the crime. They've lived through something horrific. And just because crime is dropping doesn't mean crime is stopping. Crime still occurs. There are still victims that are victimized every day. There's still people that endure the most horrific things down to the most minor things. And there are still people that experience loss, physical loss, emotional loss, financial loss, trauma of all varieties and types. You've got, both as a policymaker, regardless of your role in the system, you've got to acknowledge that's a reality and that those people need to understand what the roles are of the players, and they need to have good expectations about what the system can offer and what it can't. Frankly, I think that's a helpful place for policy conversations to start. I think there's some ripe areas, at least in Kentucky, and I think in some other jurisdictions, where a better understanding of the system and better expectations about what the system can do and what's allowed and what's not allowed. I think that's incumbent upon the system players, particularly when they work with victims. Those are chiefly going to be your prosecutors, law enforcement first, but then your prosecutors who really carry a lot of that water. And judges to a certain extent, though they are still impartial, and they're not there for the victims solely. They're there for the defendants too. And they've got to make sure that things are equitably moved through the process. But I think you've got to acknowledge that victims are real and what they've endured is real, that pain is real, and that there needs to be accountability for criminal conduct. That accountability, though, also has to recognize that the people that commit those crimes come from different places. I just submitted an op-ed just yesterday in response. I serve proudly on the Council on Criminal Justice's Women's Justice Commission. It's a 2.5 or so year project. The first recommendations actually came out today. We're recording this on Tuesday, October 7th, and this is the day that our first front-end justice system recommendations and findings have been released. So you can find those. You can Google Women's Justice Commission, and you'll see that report. But we talk about in those initial findings and recommendations, building a system that considers the background of women, but this applies to men too. But it's important that you build a system that recognizes the realities of the people that commit the crimes in the first place. This is, again, it applies to the juvenile space. One of the beauties of that bill that I mentioned before, my juvenile justice overhaul in Kentucky, is that it's trying to recognize that every kid's background is different, every kid is different, and the response to each kid is different and must be tailored to that kid. If there's a kid that's committing habitual truancy, they're constantly missing school. Before the bill that I introduced, we would just put that kid in out-of-home placement, typically in a detention facility. It could be for months at a time. There are adults that don't get punished that severely for similar sort of conduct, and this is for truancy. If they were a habitual runaway, they're consistently running away from home, it meets the statutory definition under Kentucky law as a habitual runaway, we would punish them with an out-of-home placement. But there was no response to investigate why were they running away. Is there something going on at home? If there's a woman who has committed a drug offense or a property crime, is she doing it because she's a dangerous person to society? Is she doing it because she's dealing with trauma or substance use or behavioral health or domestic violence or trauma in some way? Maybe she's a victim of trafficking and she's got no choice but to do what she's doing. Maybe she's got one or two or more mouths to feed at home. What is the background of that person? The system's got to consider that. And that works for victims too. A system and policymakers that consider that and examine that entire picture, I think, make for better system players and better policymakers.
Great. I think I've told you this, but we're only 20 minutes into the podcast recording. The general theme of the podcast is all about crime trends, data, and why people don't believe why the trends are what they are. And this is a problem going back a century. So at least a century. So I'm not going to say the numbers just yet, but in your part of Kentucky, what do you think people think about crime trends both locally and nationally?
I think the people in Kentucky think the same thing the people in Louisiana think, and the same people in Texas think, and New York and everywhere else. They all assume that crime is going up or that crime is bad or specific kinds of crime are bad. If you were to poll all 138 legislators in Kentucky, I think you'd get an overwhelming majority of them under the belief that crime is on the way up and that crime is happening and that crime is exploding, juvenile crime is exploding. It's frustrating because none of that is true, that it's dropping. And I don't know the figures and data like you do, but I know that it's going down, juvenile crime included. And I think it's happening because of a confluence of things. You've got policymakers, state policymakers that make a lot of hay and are successful politically because they can bang that drum. I think it's bad. It's a bad idea when that sort of legislating is rewarded by enactment of their bills or hearing of their bills and entertaining and fanning the flames of that sometimes nonsense. Even if it's well intended, that it can still be nonsense when and counterproductive and expensive and harmful. Ultimately to public safety if it's not informed. And we often see reactions to there. In fact, there's a case right now, or a couple of cases right now in Kentucky that are causing people to look at a program that was introduced about 12 years ago or 15 years ago. And they are knee-jerk reactions to the one edge case that we see. And everybody assumes the edge case is what happens all the time. There was a judge that made I think an unwise decision in releasing somebody on shock probation. In Kentucky, we've got something called shock probation. If you serve at least 30 days, but up to 6 months of your sentence, the judge can still probate the rest of your sentence and release you, thinking that shock, that experience of incarceration for a time, shocks your conscience into behaving better. For a lot of people, it's a really good outcome, and it does exactly what it's intended to do. I think it would work for me. I think it would work for you, Jeff. If I had to spend suddenly 60 days in prison facing a 5 or 10 year prison sentence, I might change my tune if I was shocked out. This person was shocked out and then went on to commit a bunch of other crimes or another crime that was really bad. There was a lot of people complaining about this judge and runaway judges and these dangerous people on the streets and this release and shock probation. We ought to get rid of that. Well, I think it was helpful for everybody to recognize, I wrote on this at the time, this is a bad case. I think the judge made a bad decision. And people in Jefferson County, if you disagree with this judge, by all means, run for that seat the next time it's up. beat that judge at the ballot box if you think that that judge is doing a bad job. That's fair game. Criticize their rulings. That's all fair game. But this program is used tens of thousands of times, or it's sought thousands and thousands of times. It's actually granted hardly any of those times. And so I gave the big picture for folks. Like, you're getting fired up about this one thing over here. Remember that this works a lot of the time and you never hear about it because it works all the rest of the time. And it's important to keep that perspective in mind. I think it's important that we elect people and that we work to elect people that are willing to look at the whole picture and see the data and go where it points. Regardless of whether or not that feels like that's the right decision, you got to go where the data suggests is the best path forward.
So what can we do beyond, the election process being slow? What can we do, not just waiting to elect new people, to help to convince people that when we're seeing that when crime is rising, everyone immediately believes it? When the opposite is true, and at some point crime will rise, and we'll have that conversation then, but what can we do to help people?
Well, the frustrating, especially when that happens, they're going to be like, see, we told you. Well,
Yeah.
He said crime's going up. They won't acknowledge that they were years late.
Yeah. So what can we do to get them into the space to accept when things are going well? Because at least for me, when things are going well, it's just as important because they're going well for a reason. And we all want to see lower crime.
And agree.
100% Let's find out what that is.
I think it's important for us to be persistent in the message, to reach out to our own elected officials and for organizations at the organizational level to advocate and to make sure legislators know. And we repeat, we've got to combat the noise that public safety minded legislators are hearing and that they are sharing themselves. The media environment likes to talk about crime being bad, even when it's not. I had a conversation with a reporter yesterday about a case that's got people fired up. And again, it's one of those edge case scenarios. And he's a good reporter. I wanted to make sure he understood, look, there's a lot of nuance here. I know that this is the soundbite you're looking for me to give you, or that this is the thing you want to hit on. The picture, though, is this big. There's a lot more to this, and there are a lot of pieces here that have to be taken into consideration. I think we have to be persistent in that message with our own elected officials and hold them accountable at the ballot box again. My advice to my colleagues where I work and with others, even around the country, build a relationship with your legislator one at a time. It's slow and tedious and difficult. And if there's a partisan gap between you and your elected, it's even harder. Find some common ground. I assure you there is common ground there somewhere, and build on that. It takes time. But the trust that you can build and cultivate in that individual leads to the occasion when they turn to you for counsel on this particular issue, whether it's criminal justice or public health or education or agriculture or tourism or a tax policy, whatever it is. That advocacy lesson is important, I think, for all of us to do and to relearn and to reinforce all the time. And in the meantime, as you're building those relationships, stay consistent in the message and make sure people know what the truth is. When you hear people raise the idea that crime is going up, make them prove it. Hold them accountable. Ask them to show their hand. Okay, if you think it's going up, show us your numbers. Show us where you think it's going up. And I'm the first to admit, if I'm wrong on a data point, man, I'm wrong. The data I was relying on or the data that somebody else has got is better or more accurate or more timely or more current, fine. Then respond accordingly. But they've got to be willing to see and at least be told. They may not all listen to it, and some won't, but they need to be reminded that the data shows what it shows, whether they like that narrative or not.
And let's take the opposite case. When at some point we're going to see rising crime nationally, we're going to hit sort of our nadir and things are going to reverse. How do you advise talking about these issues when that happens?
Honestly and dispassionately, to the extent possible. There are people who can give the story from a personal standpoint, and there are legislators that are very moved by that. Others are moved by data and moved by numbers and moved by cost and so forth. But I think the importance is to make sure that, it's important that you come across, you don't, I guess I want to say, you don't want to sound like you've got an axe to grind. You're not trying to go after this side or that side. You're just, show your hand. And acknowledge where you don't have information that you wish you had or that you think you need. Acknowledge where your data picture is incomplete. and be willing to say what that means you need or what that means you don't know. I think that engenders a lot of trust, acknowledging where your limits are. It's amazing how frequently people don't do that. They think that coming off as someone that knows all the answers or has all the solutions is more trustworthy or dependable. I think the person that acknowledges freely and honestly, I don't know, builds a whole lot more trust. And I think that's something to build on. But I think it's just important to be consistent and be honest about what the picture shows.
So what's next for you? We're no longer in office?
I'm going to continue doing advocacy work where there are opportunities to help policymakers around the state. I can't lobby the Kentucky legislature for another year and 2.5 months because of state law as a former legislator, but there are 49 other states that are engaged in criminal justice policy all the time. And a lot of them are doing it really well and trying to do it based on information that they know they've got, where they're trying to get the information they know they need to make the decision down the road. But there are a lot that aren't, that are shooting from the hip, that are legislating to the edge case, that are legislating based on where the political tailwinds are pushing them. And I think it's incumbent upon those of us in the public safety world that want to see better outcomes and better policies and better public safety. I think it's incumbent on us to stand up and say so and advocate where we can. I'll do that on my own if I have to, but there are other organizations that I'd love to be involved with and to stay involved with around the country that are doing this important work. I hope, in addition to philanthropies like Arnold Ventures and others, Council on Criminal Justice and MacArthur, and there are a handful of them that do great work and have done great work over decades that have put private dollars where their mouth is and really tried to make a difference and have made a really big difference. My hope is that the Trump administration and future administrations continue to use DOJ to help foster really good outcomes in law enforcement agencies and criminal justice systems around the country. I know a lot of the funding freezes that happened earlier this year have fouled that up for a lot of organizations. There's a lot of good work, though. Nonpartisan, not red, not blue, data-informed policy work that happens because of those resources. And I hope that they are freed up so those organizations can keep doing that work and keep doing the important research that is necessary to inform future work. As much data as you look at, as much information as you see on a day-to-day basis and your organization sees, and as much organizational data there is in the groups I've mentioned, you and I both know there's a bunch we don't yet know and a lot of questions we can't answer because we don't have this or that.
Absolutely. Well, that is awesome. My last question is, I need you to balance or calculate all the numbers, go through it, take a few minutes if you need to draw it out. Which is the harder job, state legislator or triplet dad?
Triplet dad, not even close. By a mile, not even close. I'm close. It's far more expensive. It's easier to raise money for a political campaign and hold office and take those arrows and stones than the logistics. I've shared this with you before. If you've got just one baby at a time, like one infant, one little kid at a time, you can just scoop the one kid up, walk out the door. Man, with three, you just can't. You can't do that. You cannot just pick one up. You've got to plan. Okay, how are we going to man and keep a hold of all three? How are we going to take them to a pumpkin patch here locally? Our big kids that are 7 and 11, they're fantastic helpers. We're not worried about them. They're good. We can trust them to wander off of bed. It's not a big deal. But man, when you got three and they're all crawling, and they all three at this moment, Jeff, have all taken steps. Not a lot, but when they become extra mobile, man, this gets way more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the Omar Bradley quote that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. I think that certainly applies. As our fellow triplet dad.
That's perfect, man.
Whitney, loved having you on. Really appreciate this very level-headed conversation. It's so needed in this world. So thanks for coming on.
This is my pleasure. They just woke up. So I'm going to go.
Perfect timing.
I'm going to go get bottles ready.
Thanks for listening to the Jeff-alytics podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and to learn more, head on over to ahdatalytics.com for more information and previous episodes. If you like what you heard, please leave a glowing review, which will help others to discover the show. Until next time, I'm Jeff Asher.